naturalization programs, and protecting family immigration. SEARAC advocates for just immigration laws that prioritize due process protections for all immigrant communities, regardless of past convictions. We also advocate for funding for education and outreach programs that reach low-income, limited English proficient communities to support them through the naturalization process. And we defend against policies that threaten our family-based immigration system and support legislation that seeks to shorten the process of family reunification. Next slide. So now I'd like to introduce everyone to our guest speaker today. Her name is Mantha Chem. She was born in Kawadong, a refugee camp located in Thailand. She immigrated to St. Paul, Minnesota as a refugee after her family fled the genocide in Cambodia. Her advocacy and organizing work began in the summer of 2016 when ICE detained her youngest brother and 7 other Cambodian Minnesotans. Following this crisis, Mantha co-founded Release Minnesota 8, where she is now the executive director. She's an advisory council member of the People's Collective for Justice and Liberation, addressing anti-Asian racism and building cross-racial solidarity. She's also an advisory board member of the Southeast Asian Freedom Network, also known as CFIN, a national group of grassroots organizers fighting for queer liberation, Black lives, youth power, gender justice, and anti-deportation, and serves as a co-chair of the API Complete Count Committee. Her lived experiences in this work involves grassroots organizing, core advocacy, legislative advocacy, reproductive justice, anti-deportation work, civic engagement, and issue-based campaigning. Please take it away, Mantha.
Thank you. Thank you guys for having me. So yeah, as Nari mentioned, I work with Release Minnesota 8, and Release Minnesota 8 began as a grassroots campaign that was forced out of crisis in August of 2016, which was led by families of 8 Cambodian Minnesotans to prevent the detention and deportation of their loved ones by ICE, and one of those individuals was my brother. Release Minnesota 8 has now grown through the active participation of Asian American grassroots community organizers and people affected by U.S. detentions and deportations of immigrants, expanding in missions to advocate for all Southeast Asian immigrants and refugees facing unjust detention and deportation. Our mission is to provide direct support to Southeast Asian families impacted by detention and deportation through community organizing and leadership development to bring about social and political change, resulting in community power to protect human rights and allow families to live together. And we believe that those who are most impacted must have power, voice, and resources for those changes to happen. But before we got to where we are, it took a lot of hard work. Release Minnesota 8 is a group of family members that have never organized before, but through our determination and resiliency, we were able to get 3 of the original 8 released, and unfortunately 5 of them had been deported. During our fight, we reached out to anyone who would listen to us. We received so many no's from elected officials, from lawyers, from community members, even business owners before we got a yes. But then we just continued to fight. We were successful because of the many strategies that we used, our community organizing efforts in partnering with local organizations, national partners such as SEARAC and CFIN, mobilizing our families, friends, church members. They all showed up for our rallies. We had different screenings that we did where we packed rooms, we packed courthouses. We worked very closely with lawyers and the law school to develop a legal strategy that was rooted in community organizing. People that we didn't think would support us ended up supporting us. And during our campaign, we also used a media strategy that gave us a lot of visibility and impacted people then started to reach out to us. We worked with local artists to construct and narrate our loved ones' stories, and we shared those videos to also continue to reach out to folks. We had designated media spokespersons so that we can tell our own stories and humanize our loved ones versus allowing others to criminalize them based on their convictions. We also used advocacy. We identified our key champions. We continued to pressure them. We realized during all of this that they worked for us, and none of us knew this before, or a lot of us didn't know. And so we even went out to DC. I went out to DC for the very first time in all of my life living in the US to just share my brother's story. We were able to narrate the stories and just talk to legislators and really just give them the insight of the stuff that we were going through and the pain that we were going through. Just showing them pictures of our loved ones that have been here all of their lives and now being picked up, for deportation years later, and just how unjust it was. And so because of our success, we knew that we and community members and organizers can do this work. And we continue to do the work even after our campaign ended. Our first person who was released released in February. His name was Ched Nin. And then we had a second person who was released, which was Samaith Nian. He was released in July. And then my brother, Chamran Pan, we call him Shorty, after over a year of campaign, he was released in September. And so currently there are over 15,000 Southeast Asians with final orders of removal. And under the current immigration laws that was passed in 1996, even lawful permanent residents and refugees can be deported for certain offenses if they are sentenced to at least 365 days. And so immigrants and refugees are getting picked up for something like breaking 3 windows and pressured into taking plea deals, most who are not even informed that their plea would lead them to immigration consequences. Now that's what happened to my brother Shorty. He was picked up to be deported for breaking a couple windows years before he was picked up, and it's just because of his 365-day sentence. And so we continue to also engage in the support of our local prosecutor, which then leads me to talk about post-conviction relief. So post-conviction relief is time barred in Minnesota, but it allows folks for due process. And because there's a time bar here, we had to continue to do effective advocacy and the community organizing and engaging in the prosecutor. And so Ramsey County Attorney John Choi's office recognized this arbitrary life sentence for my brother, and we were continuing to work with him throughout our campaign. We first met with him in November of 2016, just a couple months after the guys were picked up. And then we continued to work with him. We continued to pressure him, having conversations with their office on how they can support. And they tried to continue to push us to going the pardon route, but we knew that the pardon route wouldn't be effective for folks who, at least someone like my brother who is facing deportation because of the aggravated felony. And again, the aggravated felony is just an immigration term, which means that if you are sentenced to that 365 days or more, therefore, you are subject to the mandatory detention and deportation, which folks that are taking these plea deals are not informed of that during their original sentencing. And so when we continued to work with John Choi's office, we had been working kind of under the table, if you will. We were talking to their offices, and we were talking about post-conviction relief, and they kept saying, it's time barred, it's time barred. There are other things that you can do, but we want to support you. And so we continued to campaign, we continued to organize. And then finally, on the 1-year anniversary of my brother's detention, which was August 29th of 2017, we mobilized our community. We had like a band, like a live band playing as we rallied to his office. From our meeting in November, we had all these pictures that we took with my parents, with our community, with our loved ones, with the victim, if you will, of my brother's case, the bar owner, of his bosses, the owner of his boss. We all packed his room. And so with those pictures that we took from November, we posted them all over John Choi's office, and we're like, whose side are you on? If you said you were willing to support us. And so with that rally, they ended up giving us the green light. So we know that post-conviction relief, even though it's time barred, if we continue to do enough advocacy and effective advocacy and mobilize our communities, they are actually able to review and look at the cases and allow us that due process. And so we knew that after this rally, we ended up the next day when the press came out, they ended up giving us the green light to submit the post-conviction relief. And so we were working again with John Choi's office, and we knew that he gave us the green light to go ahead and send or submit our post-conviction relief paperwork to the judge, to the magistrate judge. And we knew that they weren't going to raise an opposition. And so because they don't raise an opposition, a lot of times the judges go with what the prosecutors would want. And we were really proud of that moment because with that, it allowed us to make systems change within Ramsey County. And so my brother was the first person in the history of Ramsey County who was able to have his 365-day sentence reduced to 364 days. And then now they are, the Ramsey County Attorney's Office is the first office to hire an immigration attorney to work within the DA's office to help them to mitigate collateral consequences. And what that means is they're able to really review documents that are coming in or cases that are coming in to see if this sentence of a 365-day sentence would be worth it for them to sentence someone to when there's a big difference in just a one-day sentence that is like, deportation or their freedom here in the US. And so that's really all that I have to share about just our campaign and the work that we did and why I continue to do this work and why we want to continue to push for post-conviction relief, the bill to pass so that it allows folks due process within the criminal and county level court so that they don't have to worry about going through these proceedings and all the hard work that we had to do in order to get my brother's release, because even though he actually went through the immigration system and the immigration courts when we filed a motion to reopen and actually was able to prove hardship, the BIA still appealed it. And it wasn't until we got post-conviction relief to be signed off by the judge was then why they had to then release my brother. But I do just want to share that right now, there's been a proposed rule change for immigration appeals, and we are asking, so I have an ask. We want folks to help us to restore due process for immigrant and refugee families by submitting a comment. And I can post it in the chat box, but what this proposed comment or this proposed new rule would do is it would allow folks not to be able to have the due process, meaning that folks won't have an opportunity in front of the immigration judge, much like Shorty, Ched, and Sam was able to do to reopen up cases for good cause. And it forces the BIA, the Board of Immigration Appeals, to quickly review an appeal in 14 days and makes the decision in 30. And we know that it takes much longer for them to do that. So if this rule becomes final, it will eliminate the sua sponte. And without it, people will not be able to reopen their cases and to use hardship for reasons, hardship or other reasons for relief or waivers, which will make it very inaccessible and harder for many of our Southeast Asian communities. And so the commenting ends tonight at 11:59 p.m. And the purpose of comments is it forces the EOIR to have to review every single comment. So it gives us extra time to work with impacted communities to be able to try to file the motion to reopen. So I'll put that in the chat and I'll turn it back over to you, Nari. Thank you again so much for giving me this time to share a little bit about Release Minnesota 8 and the work we do.
Thank you so much, Mantha. You're someone I've actually really admired even before my time at SEARAC, and it's honestly an honor to be working with you now. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And then I'll also put in my contact information in case folks want to continue to reach out to me or just volunteer with our work or anything like that.
Great, thank you so much. So next we have our agenda for today's training. We will cover SEARAC's immigration priorities and an overview of key immigration legislation with historical context, followed by a summary of the current political climate, and then go into a short Q&A session. Then we'll go into the advocacy training and go through the steps in meeting your legislator, where we will break down how to analyze a U.S. senator and how to frame your issue, which can be applied to other lawmakers. We'll do a short Q&A session, then go into a 5-minute break. We will then split into small breakout groups for an activity where we will have an opportunity to practice doing a mock legislative meeting. For historical context, the Immigration Nationality Act, also known as the INA, opened our nation's doors to immigrants from Asia and other non-European countries, representing the beginning of a fundamental shift in the definition of American. AAPIs were not able to become US citizens until the late 1940s and early 1950s, but that changed when the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act abolished the system and established an immigration policy based on reuniting immigrant families and attracting skilled labor to the United States. As a result, an unprecedented number of immigrants from non-Western countries began entering the US. The Refugee Resettlement Act is another piece of landmark policy, and it was made possible through the work of SEARAC founders who advocated for its passage. The Refugee Resettlement Act of 1980 was pivotal in its creation of a comprehensive and unified system of refugee resettlement for the first time in history. This landmark policy is the reason that millions of Southeast Asian Americans now call this country home. In 1996, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, EDPA, and the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, IRA, laws further criminalize immigrant communities by expanding provisions for which individuals could be detained and deported. This specifically impacted Southeast Asian Americans because it created mandatory immigration detention and automatic deportation proceedings against non-citizens, including lawful permanent residents. It also expanded the kinds of convictions that can make a non-citizen deportable. We have seen ICE going after folks for offenses as minor as public urination, filing a false tax return, or possessing $10 worth of marijuana. The laws were made to be retroactive, meaning that non-citizens could be deported for certain crimes, even if they were committed before the passage of this law in 1996. Now that we have an understanding of the history of immigration laws that govern immigration policy, let's take a look at the current state of play for immigration. Throughout the Trump presidency, the administration has displayed blatant cruelty and a disregard for humanity with their anti-immigrant agenda. The Trump administration also runs the Department of Homeland Security, also known as DHS, and DHS is the umbrella for, it includes Custom and Border Patrol, which is also known as CBP, and Immigrant Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE, and the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, also known as USCIS. And because these agencies are all run by the Trump administration, they are all also hostile toward immigrants. And further, USCIS recently proposed a new rule that would make it more difficult for Southeast Asian green card holders to work. Now with USCIS's new rule, if you have a final removal order, it may negatively impact an individual's ability to gain work authorization. The Trump administration's changes to USCIS's policies will undermine Southeast Asian Americans with final removal orders' ability to be self-sufficient and support themselves and their families while awaiting the adjudication of their pending cases. This is especially troublesome in light of the unprecedented economic instability the country faces during the COVID-19 pandemic. And prior to the Trump administration, a memorandum of understanding, also known as an MOU, existed. It was interpreted to exclude refugees who arrived in the United States before 1995 from deportation to Vietnam. Despite this precedent, the Trump administration announced 2 years ago in 2018 that it would reinterpret the MOU by choosing to ignore these protections for Vietnamese immigrants and refugees who arrived to the United States before 1995 from deportation. Just last month, in August, 30 Vietnamese community members were deported back to Vietnam. Some were pre-1995, meaning under the Trump administration interpretation of the MOU, no one is protected. And additionally, Congress's divided chambers have made challenges in progressing SEARAC's legislative agenda to fight against deportations, protect the family immigration system, and ensure the naturalization process is protected. Democrats in the House introduced historic bills for Southeast Asians, like the New Way Forward Act, which we will go more into detail later, and the Dignity for Detained Immigrants Act, and the Reuniting Families Act. Many of these bills never moved out of committee, sadly, and never even went to the floor for a vote, but they served as messaging tools to create awareness on important issues for the immigrant community. Depending on the election, political dynamics may shift what kind of progress can be made on immigration-related issues. So now that we know the historical context that provide a background into the pieces of legislation that make up immigration law and the current political climate, It is also equally critical to understand how immigration law and the political climate is impacting the Southeast Asian community. Many Southeast Asian refugees first arrived to the US and they were met with hostility and racism. Many refugee communities were left without long-term support in poverty-stricken neighborhoods plagued by gang violence, racial tension, and failing schools. Growing from these traumatic experiences, Southeast Asian Americans today comprise one of the quickest growing communities within the larger Asian American community. Southeast Asians are a vibrant, diverse, and growing community of refugees, the children of refugees, people sponsored by refugee families, and more recently arrived immigrants who come to the United States on family-based and employment visas. Yet, even decades after initial resettlement, institutional inequities still impact Southeast Asian communities. They have been sorely abandoned, ignored, or misunderstood. Because Southeast Asians were placed in high poverty and over-policed neighborhoods when resettled, they lacked access to adequate mental health care services and job opportunities. Many of them did not have proper access to social safety nets either. Some Southeast Asian Americans made mistakes during an era where politicians enforced being tough on crime, the war on drugs, and the rise of the private prison industry. These factors, wrapped together with the 1996 immigration laws that we just talked about, resulted in Southeast Asians facing criminal justice penalties and immigration consequences. Not only have Southeast Asians served their time for their past convictions, but they also face deportation proceedings. So instead of the US upholding American responsibility for the world's largest refugee crisis created by American political forces, the Southeast Asian community also has instead been criminalized and made deportable overnight from discriminatory immigration laws. As you can see from the data in this table, the numbers of Southeast Asian folks that have been deported have increased dramatically since 2016. A final removal order allows the government to deport a person. As you can see, over 15,000 Southeast Asians are currently in the US with a final removal order. This means that they are living in fear every day that they might get deported, be separated from their families, and sent back to a country they may have never stepped foot in before. And because folks that are presented with final removal orders are not deported immediately, they often rebuild their lives after serving their time for their past convictions. They start families and businesses, they may go back to school and get involved in the community. It might be days, months, even decades before they're actually deported. This presents a mental health and economic challenge for individuals and families who do not know if their next day with their family in the US will be their last. The deportations of Southeast Asian Americans have steadily increased across all administrations. However, the Trump administration has supported more Cambodian and Vietnamese Americans during one fiscal year than any other administration. It is worth noting that the deportations of Lao and Hmong Americans peaked during the Obama administration in fiscal year 2009 at 21 deportations. Historically, deportations of Southeast Asian Americans spiked after the United States entered an MOU with Cambodia and Vietnam. So I know that we covered a lot of information so far, a lot of historical details and background on immigration law. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box now.
Okay, so we do have a couple of questions popping up now. Someone asked, if we have a relative who qualifies for deportation, what's a good place to start to fight against that process?
I think that I will refer this question to our Director of National Policy, Com.
Hi. Can you hear me? Cool. So there are a few different ways. Our general recommendation is that folks just connect the lawyer pretty much immediately. You can reach out to us at SEARAC or to any of our partner organizations across the country. As Mata had mentioned, she's part of the Southeast Asian Freedom Network and the Southeast Asian Anti-Deportation Network, which is a coalition that SEARAC helps run. And many of those organizations have a lot of experience working with folks who are either currently detained or are in deportation proceedings. If you send us an email, what we can do at SEARAC is, have your relative generally fill out a short form, or have you fill out a short form to just collect basic information about them before we can try to filter them out to a legal organization that maybe provide more direct support to the individual. Oftentimes, it really just depends on where they're located. Depending on the state, there might not be a ton of resources. There are certain places like Texas where we've had more difficulty trying to find legal assistance for folks who are being deported because of a prior conviction, since a lot of the immigration aid there is focused on things like refugee assistance or undocumented immigrants or other issue areas. But our coalition and our partners, to the best of our ability, can provide support if you reach out. And like I said, if your relative doesn't already have a lawyer, they should get a lawyer ASAP. Things are getting very bad in this administration and are will only get worse. They've already, as Manta had mentioned, they're already trying to restrict the ability of immigrants of folks who have a final order removed from reopening their cases in the immigration courts.
Okay, so we have time for one more question. Someone asked, would it make sense to push legislation to add a statute of limitations on immigration violations? And first, could you just explain what a statute of limitations is and answer that question?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So with a statute of limitation, meaning that a conviction no longer has immigration consequences, or for many of the cases of folks being deported, they have served their time for their past convictions. However, there is no statute of limitation, meaning that they can still be put into immigration proceedings afterwards. Yes, it would make sense to support legislation that has a statute of limitation on immigration violations. And if I'm not mistaken, one piece of legislation that SEARAC has supported, which is the New Way Forward Act, does include that. And we're going to discuss more about it later in our presentation. Com, if you want to add any other things, please go ahead. Okay, great. So yeah, we only have time for those two questions so far. There is going to be another Q&A portion of the training, so we could probably or hopefully answer those later on. And if not, we can always, I'll copy these questions that are left in the chat, and then we'll try to refer back to you guys after the training. Okay, so now let's discuss the New Way Forward Act. One bill that SEARAC has been instrumental in developing and introducing this Congress is the New Way Forward Act. It is clear after everything we just talked about with the historical context and all the issues that are impacting the Southeast Asian community, it is clear we need a new vision for immigration system. It is unjust and its principles directly oppress the Southeast Asian community. Representatives Chuy Garcia, Jayapal, Bass, and Presley introduced this monumental and historical bill in December of 2019. This bill brings a racial justice lens to immigration law. Currently, immigration judges are not able to consider an individual's entire circumstance on deportation cases, meaning it doesn't matter if someone with a final removal order has been in the United States for 10 years, has children, has rebuilt their lives after serving their time. But with the New Way Forward Act, it would change so that the judges could have that discretion. The New Way Forward Act would also limit deportation for drug convictions. So folks with minor marijuana offenses would no longer be deportable. The New Way Forward Act would also create a process for those deported to have a chance to come home. That gives over 2,000 Southeast Asian folks that have been deported the opportunity to return to the U.S. and be reunited with their families. Go back. The introduction of the New Way Forward Act is historic in itself. Even though it has not passed, it serves as a vital marker and messaging tool and has been supported by 44 members of the House. That means we are moving the needle toward much needed immigration reform for Southeast Asian Americans, but we need to keep pushing and bring attention to the issue in the Southeast Asian community. So now that we have an understanding of the current political context, the immigration-related problems facing the Southeast Asian community, and the New Way Forward Act, we can now ask ourselves, how can we advocate for the Southeast Asian community? Here are a few ways to do that. One way is to limit the number of people detained by ICE. And we could do that by opposing any funding increases to ICE. By telling your member of Congress to oppose any funding for ICE, this will limit their resources and capacity to detain our community members. Secondly, if you want to restore Southeast Asian rights to due process, you can ask your member of Congress to support the New Way Forward Act, which would ensure judicial discretion so that immigration judges can consider an individual's entire circumstance before deciding to order them removed. Lastly, if you want to advocate for decreasing barriers to naturalization, you can tell your legislator to oppose any efforts that increase fees to citizenship. Just recently, USCIS did propose a new regulation that would increase the fees for naturalization. I know that, next slide, I'm sorry. So I know that asking your member of Congress to do these things can sound overwhelming because sometimes we can think of our elected officials as so far removed from our communities. But in reality, everything they do and decisions they make impact us every day. We elect them into office, we pay their salaries, and we deserve a say as to their decision making. Members of Congress can do various things to instill change. Yes, they can make and change laws, but they also do so much more, like developing national budgets. This means that how much money that goes to ICE and the Department of Homeland Security is used to detain Southeast Asian folks is decided by our members of Congress. They can also influence public opinion by authoring an op-ed. For example, one time when I was in the office of Senator Jacky Rosen, I helped author an op-ed about human trafficking. Senator Rosen, she watched a documentary on human trafficking and it sparked her interest. So we decided to write a piece about human trafficking to raise awareness about the issue during National Human Trafficking Awareness Month. And the piece was picked up by journalists at the Las Vegas Sun. Members of Congress can also direct case management. Particularly during this COVID pandemic, folks called into Senator Rosen's office concerned about the unemployment and about getting laid off. So our office would help constituents get connected to the Unemployment Commission to get answers to the questions. If someone needs help with a federal agency like ICE, you can also contact your member of Congress and they may be able to escort folks to their ICE check-ins so they don't get detained. This has happened before. Members of Congress have a desire to elevate their platform. That's important to remember. So they will be also willing to attend local events, and that's a request that you can make to them. The first step in asking them to do anything for you, though, is to prepare a meeting with them. Before your meeting, you should research your elected officials, find out who represents your district, and you can schedule a meeting with them by calling their office. Members of Congress have offices in both DC and in the state they represent. Right now, during COVID, things may look a little bit different. You can request a virtual meeting with them through video or phone call. Before your meeting, you should have an agenda. If you're organizing a meeting with multiple people, make sure everyone knows their role in the meeting. You should know what issue you want to present and have an ask for them. Your issue may be that Southeast Asian Americans are being deported at increasing rates, and you ask them to co-sponsor the New Way Forward Act. So in your meeting, you want to introduce yourselves and the organization or group you represent in any way, or if any. It's important in the meeting to let them know if you're a constituent, if you're a voter in their district, or you can even bring a constituent from their district. This is because your issue matters more to the staff member if you are from their district. You can include if you're a business owner, if you're involved in any local community projects, or if you have children that attend school in their district. I want to reiterate the importance right now of having an agenda, because you don't want to waste your time or their time. It is critical to have a goal in mind during these meetings, not to derail too much and to be concise, because you typically will only have 10 to 20 minutes of their time. My favorite part of being in Senator Rosen's office was taking meetings, honestly, because I would get educated on new topics all the time and get presented with possible solutions. Staffers like me, when I was a staffer in the Senate, we are not experts. They will probably have questions for you, and they might not know anything about the issue you're presenting to them. Please be honest in your meetings. If you don't have an answer to a question, you can respond with, "I'm not sure, but I can follow up with you when I find out more information." And when you present your issue, you need to present concisely what the problem is, and you can do that by using data like fact sheets or graphs. You should tie your issue into a story somehow. Staffers are more likely to remember you if you have a compelling story. I can distinctly remember a time I took a meeting in Senator Rosen's office with an individual that came to lobby about LGBTQ rights. He told an emotional and powerful story about being LGBTQ, and it stuck with me. I felt more willing to help this person because his story pulled at my heartstrings, and it felt more personable. Lastly, always have a clear ask. You don't want to leave the meeting with the staffer not knowing what it is you want from them. Following up is so important. Bring business cards with you if you have them. If you're doing this in person, and ask them for their business cards. Send an email afterwards with any additional materials they might have for you, or resources you want to share to back up your case. Sometimes staffers in the Senate could have 4 meetings in a day, probably way more in the House. It's important to follow up on your ask and build a relationship with them. For example, I particularly remember one constituent who was an educator. He was extremely personable and talked about his children's experience being Filipino and Black and the struggles they face with the model minority myth. After our meeting, he sent me an email following up on his ask and recommended a book he thought would interest me based on our meeting on the needs of AAPIs. So remembering that staffers are just humans and that they are flawed and imperfect like all of us, they won't remember every single detail in your meeting, and they would benefit from reminder emails with key points discussed in your meeting. So we're going to move on now to knowing you're elected. So for framing your issue, you have to remember that all members are different. Not each member's office will react the same to an issue being presented to them. So it's important to present your issue in a way that they will care. For example, Senator Mike Lee from Utah is a conservative member who has been vocal on being against abortions. Your strategy in lobbying him is going to be totally different than lobbying Senator Patty Murray, who's been a champion for reproductive justice and healthcare. So let's analyze my former boss, Senator Jacky Rosen. If we wanted to lobby her to oppose funding to ICE to decrease deportations of Southeast Asians, what would that look like? We know Senator Rosen from this analyst. She cares about immigration or immigrant issues because she has been active and vocal on DACA. She has an interest in oversight of CBP facilities and nice practices. We know this because on her website, you can find under many of her press statements regarding her efforts to ensure DHS is held accountable for their actions. Senator Rosen is also a member at HESCAC. HESCAC is the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. This is the Senate committee that has oversight over DHS. So you can watch her testimonies in the HESCAC hearings to learn more about where she stands on immigration issues, because HESCAC hearing recordings are made public on the HESCAC website. And being a member of HESCAC means Senator Rosen has more power in providing oversight to ICE because she is part of the committee that has jurisdiction over the operations of DHS. Moreover, Nevada has a large Southeast Asian population. This is really important to note in your meeting. She is a member of CAPAC, the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. Bringing all these factors together, tying all those factors together, you can lobby the senator by introducing yourself to her staff, presenting the problem that ICE is detaining and deporting Southeast Asians at an alarming rate, and that Nevada, the state she represents, is being impacted because of a large Southeast Asian community there. As a member of HESCAC, Senator Rosen needs to ensure DHS is being held accountable and know that their cruel tactics are separating our Southeast Asian communities. Include your personal story and end the meeting by telling her staff that she needs to oppose any funding for ICE. So I know that was also like a lot of information. So if anyone has any questions, like now would be the time to drop it in the chat box.
Oh, we have a really great question here. If your representative is a Republican, do you have any advice on how to approach that meeting?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I did give a little bit of an example with Senator Mike Lee from Utah. He is a Republican and he's very conservative, especially on abortion issues. And so when going into a meeting with a Republican, you still want to do the same things that you would do for Democrat senators or members of Congress. You would want to research them, understand better what they care about, their stance on the issue. So if you're lobbying them regarding immigration-related issues, if it's on deportations, you're going to want to know what is their history, their voting history on deportation legislation. What is their history voting for appropriations bills, the Homeland Security appropriations bills. So understanding and knowing you're elected is really, really important. And then I think that you could still go in and tell your story to them and present the facts to them, and the staff members will listen. But it really, I think that keeping in mind the efforts that they have done either to undermine immigrants or to protect them is important. And Com, if you have any input, please feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I think the key thing to remember with Republican offices, particularly if you're doing it on behalf of a nonprofit, is that you should be lobbying and advocating with Republicans. In my experience, sometimes you just sort of have to understand whether or not a member of Congress might be a lost cause and move on, and that there are other members of Congress that are more worth your time. Even amongst Democrats, this particular issue can be relatively controversial. And the way that we've been able to deal with certain Republicans and certain Democrats is framing it specifically from an economic standpoint, and focusing on the sort of data, the Southeast Asian data in their within their district, and then just trying to move them with their constituency, knowing that, you know, on our own, like, moral arguments won't work with them because you know, it just doesn't mesh with their framework. And for, you know, very conservative members of Congress, you know, when we go into those meetings and you realize that, one, they don't care, that's useful too, right? Because I think for a lot of nonprofit work, a lot of advocacy and civil rights organization, it's good to know when a member of Congress doesn't care, so that you can move on to, like, other members of Congress who are more worth your time and who might be needed for votes or for bills. It doesn't mean that they can't come around, though, right? I think a lot of members of Congress stay in office for a long time, and, you know, it is a sort of evolutionary process for a lot of them. I think, you know, we've seen it with members like Senator Amy Klobuchar, who it took almost a decade to get her to sort of come around to the Southeast Asian, to oppose Southeast Asian deportations more forcefully and more publicly. So it's really just, you know, continuous education, and sometimes you just have to wait for the political climate to shift as well. So, you know, in this Congress, it's going to be very difficult for you to move a Republican on more progressive issues. But if the political climate shifts in the 117th Congress, you know, you might have a better shot, right? Because they might be more willing to negotiate.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Com, for that context. I think we're going to move forward now, and we're going to go into a break for 5 minutes, and we're going to come back and do a breakout activity. So please come back in 5 minutes. Thank you. All right. All right, thank you everybody so much. And I just we do have a few more minutes. We have like around 14 minutes. If anybody wanted to share out about something that they learned during the breakout activity, this would be the time. We can allow people to unmute at this time to share if they'd like to. Or if anyone has any questions at this time too, you can put in the chat box as well.
Hello?
Hi. Hello.
Hello, can I speak?
Yeah.
Good. Thank you. My name is Phu Savasana. I think I share this with the group. I'm from Cambodian. I chụp điệp xua khmui tang in Cambodian. If you understand Khmer. Uh, I have a question and I thinking about it. I had the opportunity to meet some of those deportees in Cambodia. And I feel when I was in Cambodia 2 years ago, I met the 2 or 3 of them. They live in Pagoda now. And I take a lot of time listen because I feel a lot of pity, a sense of human thing to them. They are really distressed. They really not having a sense of belonging with regard to every facet of life they restructure. So basically, there's 2 dilemma Nari, with regard to this. Number one is, the policy of the United States. And Cambodia has the most important thesis. The other dilemma is the government of Cambodia to accept those. The United States cannot deport those people without Cambodia agree to do it too. So how would you address this issue? And I think the agreement was signed, in early 2017 or 2016 with Saw King signature. Saw King is the Ministry of Interior. So with this in mind, that's the facet is the issue is not us here want to lobby. So how we can make sure that the authority in Cambodia too, stop taking this, because in Cambodia we don't have the facility and the a safety net to really allow those people to uh, relive their life. They have enough hard time to even feed their own people there by having more people. So those people, they was abandoned on the street. Most of them live in Pagoda right now and in front of the Royal Palace. So how would you respond to them, Nari? Thank you.
A great question. Sorry, I just turned off my camera to get some water. Nora, if you could just speak to maybe the experience, if you have any thoughts, or I've heard stuff from community members about how to support individuals that have been deported and how to support them, even as they are largely folks that don't have connections to Cambodia or the countries that they've been deported to.
Yeah, that is a great question. And I have heard some things from our work with our partners and coalitions regarding what it looks like when folks are deported back to Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. And it is unfortunate because a lot of people have never been there. They might not speak that language. They might not have any resources for them. And I think that my colleague Sina has a lot more experience working with our partners regarding this. And if Sina, if you could provide your input, that would be great.
Oh, sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Nari, for tapping me in. I'll just reply quickly so I don't take up too much space here in case we have other questions. I'm happy to connect with Lapu Savanchana outside of the space too, and anyone else who's interested in learning more about the support groups and national networks who offer support to those who have been deported to Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Currently, there's one official group that operates in Cambodia. They were originally titled One Love Cambodia, but now they are a work group agency. So they offer work support in Cambodia to those who are needing language and community and work in Cambodia. And so I can share more of that info off this webinar if folks and community are interested in it, and there are groups starting up in Laos and Vietnam to offer the same type of community support to those who have been removed to the Southeast Asian countries.
Great, thank you so much, Sina. And I just want to also reiterate and emphasize that this is the reason why we, SEARAC has supported the New Way Forward Act and was instrumental in its introduction, is because we understand the importance of having a right to return back home for individuals that were deported. And that's why it's very crucial to let your members of Congress know and your elected officials know that those that are being deported should have a pathway for them to come back home and be reunited with their families. And one way to do that is to support the New Way Forward Act. So if we don't have any more last questions, I can end it now here and letting everyone know that if there's any other questions, like I'll drop my email address in the chat box and we can chat through email. I just want to say thank you so much, everybody. And this concludes our Immigration Policy 101 training. Thank you so much for participating in SEARAC's first digital advocacy training. And thank you also to all my colleagues at SEARAC for an amazing job at building and executing this training. Thank you to our sponsors,